Hello everyone, today we make an introduction on the late Republican Roman helmets, which wants to be a foreword, generally speaking, not just on this period, on the Roman armor and weapons, but more or less a general consideration on how we tend to classify weaponry in the ancient world. We will probably stick to the Roman army, there is no need to expand it. But it's still particularly important because there is an evolution, right? Everyone who has a certain understanding of the Roman military knows that the Roman army has constantly changed. There was never, we normally identify more or less these moments in Roman history as if there was a selective way of distinguishing these periods, but it's not really like that, and it's very useful to let's say fluidify this conception, especially looking at the armor and the equipment in general, because from one side you find that there is a great continuity in the essentials for what concerns the armament of the ancient fighters in general. The Roman legionnaire in himself was not, in fact, dramatically different in equipment from the rest of the very average warrior that existed out there. I'm talking specifically about warrior because, of course, the Roman legionnaire was a soldier at this time. The late Republic finally becomes a professional trooper, not just a militiaman, occasionally recruited like it was theoretically up to the mid-Republic. We will definitely deal with these topics in other dedicated videos. But if you look at the essential, yeah, right, the equipment was more or less the same. An armor, which was rare, telling the truth now, the Roman legionnaires all were equipped with armor at this point because Rome was freaking powerful, rich, and was structuring even a military administration that was able to provide the equipment for his legionnaires. But if you look at the equipment, basically it's, armor is rare out there, but in the rest of the world was something extremely expensive. But if looking at the essentials, a helmet, a sword, a shield, and a javelin, or more javelins actually, because that's what these fundamentally were the equipment of the average soldier out there, the average trooper warrior that was elsewhere in the world. So this naturally opens to several considerations. You might say, well, I don't know, the Macedonian pikeman wasn't equipped like that. Yeah, but it was kind of a very narrow exception that also stemmed in part from similar grounds in terms of of the development of a professional army, like was the Macedonian one back in the day, and against which the Romans also confronted, and having fundamentally similar military systems. At that point, tactics were relatively different, but actually not so much. Also, this is another topic we have to address at a point, because there is this obsession of classifying, of saying, this is like that because it has this finite, precise boundaries, and it was substantially different from this other thing. It was like completely another thing. But at that time, asymmetry was extremely low, and it would remain like that, like forever. There are people out there who believe that. I love the Romans, let's be honest about this, but I'm also, I believe, aware enough of military history and exactly Roman military history to understand that objectively, the difference, the effectiveness of the Roman army didn't stand in this, in their equipment. The equipment was definitely adjusted to the tactics that the Roman legionnaires were capable of, but principally it was a matter of organization, logistics, discipline, training, all things that actually come to make the difference in the quality of the soldier and not much in what he's equipped with. Also in here, huge digressions that are possible to make, but let's stick to helmets. Helmets are important because they, for many reasons, actually they're very overlooked, even in terms of equipment. Protecting your head is definitely a top priority in every situation. What you generally see around in pop culture is not people care extremely much about helmets, and the problem is that the scanty evidence of armor that in general have for the ancient world, but also for others, is that we tend to focus especially on weaponry and sometimes on armor, because it's kind of they're also relatively not easier to find, but they're the thing that fundamentally attracts the most your attention. People don't really care much about helmets. They say, well, okay, yeah, the helmet is just something like that. Also, there are not massive differences in helmets. Like, you may argue, well, there are not massive differences in shields, and in fact, people don't care much about shields. But these are all elements that are kind of important, and especially the headgear has many other values attached, not just this standard protection to the most vulnerable and at the same time valuable part of your body, that is your head, but the also a greater, even a sort of alter ego attached to the idea of the helmet, which is not really the case because it was fundamentally the weapon that did that. But if you think about crests, or if you think about other the appearance of the soldier, definitely the helmet played a very important role and is definitely overlooked most of the times. This is important because when you look at Roman helmets at this time, you realize that most of them were actually there is nothing that is fundamentally Roman by definition, and this opens once again endless parentheses that you can open. But the point I wanted to make is that the Roman helmet at this time was still extremely personalized. Even though the Montefortino type especially was the most widespread, the kind of the easiest to produce, also this kind of dome with a bit of neck guard, and that from which other models also kind of evolved. But even if you look at the Montefortino, in fact, this wasn't anything that the Romans produced by themselves. You know that Roman equipment has this melange of elements essentially drawn from the material culture of several other peoples, chiefly the Celts, interestingly enough, but also from the Greeks that were also for evident reason the development of the military, the Hellenistic kingdoms, kind of the very influential, also very rich entities that in this sense had a deep commercial penetration into Central Europe and to the Italic peninsula, and they as well, and therefore the Roman army at this point wasn't really producing still anything kind of standard in many ways. And the late Republic is a period in which we can't really say we lack a lot of evidence, but in which we have tended a little bit to stereotype what the average Roman soldier, Roman legionnaire would look like. Say, okay, well, more or less this was their gear, but we would probably be very, very surprised to see, just aside from helmets, but in general, how different and heterogeneous actually a Roman legionnaire could look. Once again, we're not here to speak specifically about this. It would open enormous, other endless questions in terms of how these helmets were actually produced. A lot of things about the technology of the ancient world. But what we have is essentially a variety that certain scholars have tried to kind of classify, to say, okay, well, all right, there is a great diversity, but let's take into consideration certain prototypes and say, okay, it's from this group that we can start saying that there are other similar elements, more or less, that can fit into it, and that there is a sort of distinction. In this sense, the archaeological finds and the iconographic evidence naturally have offered us a certain, a discrete idea of the wall. We have several representations today. By the way, we will not talk directly about the several types that actually are mainly three at this point: the Montefortino, the Colus, and the Agen-Port. But we can understand from this evolution fundamentally why from these types, why the Romans were equipped like that at this point, why there were certain changes occurring, and how the Roman military was fundamentally starting to equip his troops with this kind of helmets. In previous times, since even archaic times, not just the early Middle Republic, there were kind of several helmets that the Roman army used, or better, that the Roman soldiers equipped themselves with, or also this fact of when is that the Roman legionnaire starts to be actually supplied by the state is a question that would require a bit of introduction, because people believe automatically, like a mantra, that Marius arrived, and from that moment the legionnaire stopped to bring equipment from home, and Marius with a magic stick created stuff that was given just to the soldiers that were now hired without distinction of sensual classes. But this is not really like that. It's actually since the 3rd century at the latest, I believe, that the Roman army began to effectively supply troops with equipment that the individual soldiers didn't have to provide by themselves. This happened for many reasons, actually, and it all lays, however, to make the long story short, in the progressive professionalization of the Roman army, the permanent of several legions on the field, and therefore to the necessity of having a supply that at this point had nothing to do with the ideal of the peasant soldier that brought his handmade, presumably, stuff from home. Even from there, you can't really actually believe that. It's obvious that Roman soldiers, probably since the very beginnings of Rome, never actually had was the typical warrior that produced just weaponry in its clan. Rome, as a political or politically organized body, was already a center of some value, with certain level of sedentarization, of armor production, etc. So it's obvious that citizens initially, presumably, both their arms, they definitely kept within themselves, also because it was a kind of a violent world that things could escalate into violence. So that was, everybody was presumably armed, but that eventually Rome tends also to disarm its citizens. It forbids even from a certain point onwards to have weapons in the city, to actually have armies marching in the city after the triumph. This time the Roman legions are always out of Italy proper. Italy meant as ancient Italy, that is fundamentally central and southern Italy, the peninsula, and so there are lots of transformations in this process, and we can say, however, that as long as the Romans remained confined to the Italian peninsula itself, so roughly until the First Punic War, but even in that sense, even a bit later, because up to the Second Punic War, actually a great part of the Roman, a consistent part of the Roman politicians didn't want to expand into the Mediterranean. This is pretty famous. Think about Cato against Scipio, that because there were several interests. Fundamentally, opening to the sea meant to shift the power, the money flow to those who were into the maritime trade, whereas great part of the Roman nobility was still into the agricultural activities, into Italy, etc. And it was also, generally speaking, a conservative, traditionalistic mindset that the Romans actually held for a very long time, even regarding to these things, for which coming out of Italy and creating an empire proper, that is to rule over foreign lands, like creating provinces, etc., was outside of the Italic environment, was something that they look favorably upon for quite a time. So there was a resistance. But let's say that given that geographical boundaries, the Roman equipment had remained influenced chiefly by Greek and Italic material culture. So that Italy, like many other countries in the Mediterranean, like Gaul and like Spain, etc., and other regions that were let's say, more developed, like take even Carthage or other, was deeply influenced in material culture, as we said before, by the Greeks, because at this time those were the wealthiest ones. They produced a lot. They also made a lot of wars on their own. So they exported models of they exported weaponry, armor, etc. So the Italic aristocracy initially, not just the Romans, but actually the rest of the Italic tribes and even the Etruscans, but even the Celts, they inhabited there, or the Illyrians, etc., were strongly influenced by Greek material culture. This, by the way, gave birth to, even in historiographically speaking, to this idea for which fundamentally, if you keep yourself like, in this case, a Greek, it's because you fight like a Greek with kind of Hellenic tactics and all this stuff. And this has led to extreme misconceptions that are still, widely believed out there, such as that the Romans kind of copied Greek tactics with the phalanxes. There is this, pretty naive approximations that are still done, actually not understanding much of these topics. I'm sure there is the genius who comes out now and saying, oh well, but the Romans had the phalanx, and all that stuff, and there are people who even believe that, I don't know, the Carthaginians actually had phalanxes or even pikemen and stuff like that. There is a huge ignorance on this topic. We will have to go very deep into that pretty soon, because that's actually probably one of the most important topics ever for understanding the genesis and therefore the genetic character in itself of the Roman military, that is grossly overlooked and grossly forgotten, because people concentrate just on the empire, because like the empire is kind of the only thing that is, as if Rome was always Rome and it was born like that. Rome, in fact, just like the proverb says, was not made in one day. But there is much about the Roman military that is still deeply misunderstood, and studying these periods, like the first truly historical periods of Rome, so roughly since the 4th, 3rd century BC, because before it's just history mixed with myth. Fundamentally, just for the record, I don't think there is someone out there who believes that figures like, I don't know, Furius Camillus were a historical figure, but it's still widely believed, and there is still this stigma attached to the Roman republicanism that of the origins that was propagandated by the same Romans in later times, applying categories that were developed later to times where this was not even dreamt of. The tribal and warrior milieu of origin of Rome is widely and grossly forgotten. I don't know why I came to this, but the idea was, however, that the Romans were pretty akin to, they stemmed fundamentally from their a warrior background. Their original equipment were, as we were saying, chiefly Italic and Hellenic oriented, because the Gauls had started interfering with the Romans since now the 4th century BC. They also brought into the Roman military some elements, but originally Rome actually stems from a mostly Italic background, also in terms of material culture. So what you find in progressively towards this later phase is that there is a common core that is still kind of Italic looking, right? And that gets progressively eroded and softened by the expansion of Rome into the Mediterranean, where Rome starts becoming, in terms of material culture, something extremely similar to the broader, to the Hellenistic world broadly meant. Even the Celtic influence, in this sense, has to be regarded not just because of the contact with the Romans, with the Gauls, but also with some transformations that were occurring even into the Hellenistic world. Think about the spread of the Tureos and actually of the Celtic mercenaries all around the Mediterranean. Also in here, that there are not easy connections you can make, like by saying, this was a direct influence, I don't know, the usage of Celtic mercenaries, but let's say that Rome has also a very strongly Hellenistic side that is overlooked, and there are ways that there is, like always in military history, some back and forth of these influences. For instance, it's very evident that the Romans were influenced by the Celts at several times in their history, that got more or less intensified. Just think about the Roman conquest of Gaul. That definitely brought to a reinjection of Celtic weapons and armor and technology broadly meant into their army. Which doesn't mean that there is also the gross misconception that acquiring a technology means to steal it. There is this obsession certain Westerners have with this idea of cultural appropriation, that as if cultures and civilizations had something that is original just of theirs and that didn't come from anyone. Civilization stemmed from places that have nothing to do with Europe, by the way, at this time, and they all copied them from them. But this moment of copy, on the other hand, doesn't mean anything in terms of superiority or inferiority, which are typically there are typical 19th century technologistical prejudices. If in these times you have a civilization that is able to integrate a technology from another one, just guess what? It means that civilization is already as advanced as the one was taking those things from, because technologies and other abilities cannot be applied if your civilization is not at the point of knowing how they are already used and being capable of absorbing them. The Romans, in this sense, were great, and we often underestimate, in this sense, the original Roman characteristics in their military. We tend to believe, in fact, because of this silly and childish technologistic stereotypes typical of modern mindset, that the Romans basically were great because they copied stuff from others. But the Romans had a completely opposite mindset. The Romans actually created a military system that was unknown at the time. This doesn't mean to make propaganda about Romans. It's to try to embellish them. Absolutely not. But if you see how they developed their military system, if you study it, you analyze it, basically was something that was unknown at the time. In the way it evolved, chiefly not just in military terms, but from a political and social point of view. So that even when you say, the Romans copied originally the Greek phalanx, that's false. There was never an Hellenic type phalanx in Rome like we imagine it. Like, there's never been in Etruria, nor in Carthage, nor in any other place outside of Greece narrowly meant. Same goes for the phalanxes of the Macedonian phalanx. And if you look at these military systems, you realize actually that the Romans were impressively advanced in their... They definitely grew. They definitely started from a moment in which they probably weren't actually that much. The development of the Roman military was very fast in many ways. I mean, dependingly on what standards you want to take, but at the same time, it was grounded on very solid basis that had a very specific and original and basically unique organization in history. I repeat, not from a military point of view, which was a consequence, also was like that, but chiefly from a political and social point of view. Rome did something that no other civilization had done. It was essentially extending its citizenship to the subjugated peoples, eventually being able to Romanize them, to participate into the Roman politics and military. That's why the Greeks got conquered by the Romans, because they failed to do the same thing. And Rome had naturally also other characters, but it gets down essentially to this ability of considering the absorption of other elements. And this is true actually from the very beginning of Roman society. Rome was born fundamentally from this Latin and Sabine and partly Etruscan tribes that joined together and always maintained this kind of open, this inclusiveness, let's say, of external elements in order to back. Eventually things got kind of not really sclerotic, but it obviously was an elite at a certain point. It kind of rose to the top heads. But even especially towards the late Republic, what you see is that Rome expands, not without conflict internally to its society, by the way, for struggling for expand citizenship outside of there. And if Rome hadn't extended its citizenship, it would have remained in Latium, and that's it, pretty much. It would have never been a Roman Empire. The greatness of the empire, its expansion capabilities, all stem from that. Then I don't know why we got here, but I always get carried away when we're talking about Roman history. But the whole idea is that I was making is that this Hellenic Italic equipment, including helmets, starts fundamentally in parts gets modified, in parts remains into the Roman army. The reason was that there was in all these peoples of the Mediterranean an archaism related in part to the local traditions, like the strictly Italic weaponry and armor were considered, something traditional that the warrior was kind of happy to wear, also because they were naturally also functional to a certain degree to certain tactics. The Italic peninsula was also pretty varied. The Latins were Italics, but within the Italics were other peoples that, they spoke in this sense very similar language. They belong to the same stock. They are the ones to which Rome extends its citizenship for the sake of, of this, affinity that was felt definitely, and this that was definitely not done for charity, because Rome effectively swallowed the independence of all these populations, but at the same time it made it participate to this, and in the process the facies of the Italic warrior changed into the one of the Roman soldier. Just always remember that Italic is an ethnic term, right? Roman is a political one. So when you talk about the Italics, you talk about this branch of the Indo-European peoples that settled roughly in the Italian peninsula, and from which partly the ethnicity, great part of the Roman ethnicity of the first days stemmed from. But Rome, in this sense, is always political. There's never been a single moment in Roman history in which being a Roman meant to belong to a certain race, to a certain ethnicity, to be to have a to be Latin mother language. It was never ever like that. And when you speak about Romans, you speak about citizens of Rome, which is a completely different thing from saying, I'm an Italic, I'm a Celt, I'm a German, whatever. It doesn't matter. You're Roman. You can relate to, today's United States of America. It's a melting pot of so many different cultures and peoples that, however, own this unique national commitment that makes them American. Doesn't matter what they look like, what their ancestors came from, etc. So Rome was a bit like that. And naturally we're comparing, very approximately, but just this is particularly important because people get it wrong all the time. There are especially people who are obsessed by the idea that Rome somewhat there was a pure Rome at the beginning. that, I don't know, belong to the favorite historical character that you want. But if Scipio had seen, I don't know, Julius Caesar's Rome, would have thought, Rome is over. Just like if Caesar had seen, Trajan's Rome, he would have seen, Rome is over. Same goes over again. So Rome was never one thing; it always changed, and it's the civic unity at its base that actually made Rome what it has been historically. So in the equipment, this transition is important to observe, because the Italic warrior was essentially a tribesman who lived into this a Pannonic environment. Also was not much about particularly thick and compact formations, etc. It was chiefly about skirmishing, like all the other warriors, all the other average warrior in Europe at the time. There's a striking homogeneity in this sense. Definitely Italy was a bit of a hybrid, because it was still kind of a tribal world, but it was massively influenced by Mediterranean civilization. So even though the internal, the populations of the Italian hinterland still were kind of tribal peoples, you find, the south of the peninsula, there's the Hellenic colonies, then you have Rome that rises, the Etruscans also have their so-called Dodecapolis, that actually nobody actually know what the actual 12 cities were, but there were other things that were kind of a bit more advanced. And Rome, in this sense, progressively expanding into the peninsula, transforms the Italic warrior into and therefore a warrior is typically indisciplined, fighting for his own prestige and charisma and for the clients. So Rome transforms these guys, by the way, with great difficulties initially speaking, into cold-blooded professionals of war with an incredible discipline that actually also in here there would be a lot to tell, because part of the success of the Roman military was also kind of maintaining this pristine warlike individualistic mindset that is also often overlooked. This extreme emphasis on the idea of deformation, the fact that the Roman legionary was chiefly just a formation guy. It's not really like that. The Roman legionary was definitely disciplined, but it also was very individualistic minded, and this is also what we know from his equipment in part, but also from what actually the very few things we know about Roman tactics, because let's forget also that we know how Romans actually fought, because nobody actually knows that. We lack massive information about even how the armies were deployed, how they fought. There's plenty of people out there who seemingly know everything about it, but you can easily spot the fact that they don't know anything, and in this sense, because nobody knows, there is no evidence of any sort, and this is universally known to anyone who even starts to approach the ABC of these topics. So if there is someone who says otherwise, just look from the other side. You're not missing anything important. But from at the same time, there is a kind of, if you want to have antiquary taste that remains for certain kind of equipment, like this traditionalist local, in this case Italic types, variations that were kind of a bit more sophisticated, let's say, than what was among the Celts, for instance, or among the Iberians, because the Italic were somewhat more civilized. They were closer to civilization in many ways, but they were still kind of local and tribal in nature, and then also a classicistic taste for ancient Hellenic gear. This is something you find actually everywhere in tribal Europe during the Iron Age. I mean, and this is all the more evident among those peoples who were closer to the Mediterranean, like the Iberians, the Italics, especially also the Balkanic peoples like the Illyrians or the Thracians or the Dacians, because these were the populations who were closer to those Mediterranean traffics that we were talking about before. So they had an early approach to Greek material culture, and they treasured what sometimes were maybe just already outdated into the Greek world over time into their, especially the elites were, as always, the elites are always extremely receptive, may be xenophobic sometimes when it comes to actual political interference in their affairs, that they want to prove in front of the peoples that, yeah, they're not really for change because they're the ones who are in charge of the thing. But when it comes to material culture, the elite always, especially of these tribal peoples, takes from the best, from what is reputed, not just the most military effective, but actually sometimes the most fashionable, quite simply, even aesthetically speaking, equipment that is out there. So for these peoples, the Greek stuff had been kind of treasured, and they liked it, and sometimes this equipment was, you know, remained treasured and handed down to generation from generation to generation, just because it was, you know, the ancient expensive stuff. This simply also, for some reason, that is also soundly material, because in the Greek world you find that from the original Hellenic hoplitic phalanx, that was extremely heavy, at least in its best ranks. There is a progressive, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's when you lose weight, fundamentally. So hoplites already by the 4th century, already by the 5th century actually, and then in the 4th, tend to get lighter and lighter, and therefore also their equipment kinds of get also in their kind of more massively produced, and therefore cheaper, and it's functional to larger formations of more troops that in this sense are not valued for their individual prowess as sole individual fighters, but for the training, for the formations, for the tactics, can happen like that. So what happens is that these tribal peoples that still fight in a kind of a heroic fashion, you know, style that also never quite existed in its extremes, but yeah, it was kind of the chieftain who had this great power and charisma and was meant to go there in the battlefield at the head of everybody with the best equipment, etc., tend to treasure this heavier stuff of the old days, of classical Greece, not of the Hellenistic times, and to transform it sometimes into a kind of a style. So that into the Roman army, for instance, you find this Apulo-Corinthian or Attic helmets that definitely want to imitate those ancient classical designs that at this point are not even, you know, functioning anymore. For instance, the Apulo-Corinthian one is often used with like a you know, originally the one that was covering the Corinthian helmet was covering the face, right? Instead, if you look at the Apulo-Corinthian helmets of this period, realize that the face cover is now rising up, and is actually fake. Doesn't protect the face, even though has remained with the facial design on the top of it, and now the face in reality is discovered. It's just it's not functional anymore, but it still had to look like that in the form, in the design. That is something exterior, but at the same time tells you how influential the Hellenistic styles now had become, perhaps the greatest influence of this Hellenistic taste into the Roman army is exactly this one. That is fundamentally during the 2nd century BC, and largely also for at least the first half of the first BC. Naturally, Apulo-Corinthian and Attic helmets remain, especially among military commanders, like, you know, even for parading and just showing off like ceremonial stuff, so that are partially completely detached from, you know, from actual usage, which is never 100% true, because, you know, one in another, it's always still a piece of metal that can protect you from things, but, you know, it can be very heavy, it can be very elaborated, extremely expensive, by the way. So naturally, what starts instead to be used by soldiers is something very, very different, and always kind of cheaper in part, although there are variations, as we will see now. So there are these typologies that are maintained a little bit, and that sometimes also in iconography are showed, because if you, say, want this equipment to be represented on your grave, you want maybe this kind of Hellenistic, cool Hellenistic looking helmet that just looks fine, but maybe you use a more functional one, and sometimes we can't really assess what the reality was because we have a few sources from this, and we can't really tell how it was like in the mass. So we have a relatively few finds that we lack that kind of structural knowledge of the wall and how it really was in general. So you look at the panoply of tribunes, other characters of very high rank. From the iconography of the period, you can't see still these helmets, but these were, getting kind of an elite. For what concerns the helmets, they were instead worn by the majority of the troops in this period that goes, let's say, from the Punic Wars and to the deeds of Caesar in Gaul, into civil wars, etc. Archaeology has recently actually found a pretty good number of examples, even in good conditions, and great part of these helmets remained in service, remain in use actually for a long time, even in the following imperial period, sometimes even very far beyond the Augustan age, and at this point we stop because naturally we go beyond the late Republic, and therefore we will address that another time. But it's still important to see also in here that there is a continuity of certain elements and at the same time certain transformations that were more or less, by the way, secondary, if you want, because the ratio, let's say, of the helmet was fundamentally similar. We see now. Let's give a look to these changes. By the way, another consideration about the the stereotypization we've made of the early imperial Roman legionnaire. Now it's widely known, as just I think most of you already know that the typical the iconic, let's say, legionnaire type that you find basically in every documentary, in every I don't know, because now today we learned how not to generalize too much, but the typical standard Roman legionnaire with the so-called this famous segmented armor and the Italic or Gallic imperial helmet. I made a video on the Gallic helmet, by the way, types, and the gladius and the rectangular shield and that red color that pops out everywhere is definitely just a brutal approximation. I made something about the Roman colors. I think the video is Roman shield color shield patterns or Roman shield patterns or something like that. If you're interested, you find everything into the Roman warfare playlist. The point I wanted to make, though, is that another element that is not very much considered because nobody cares about helmets more than much is that effectively, if you look especially the early Roman Empire, most of these initial helmets you start finding from the late Republic were actually for very much in use, for very long time in use. We will see that more specifically more in detail when we will see specifically every single type of helmet. But just for instance, like the Montefortino type was initially probably adopted from the Romans by the Gauls. It's something you find for forever, like in the early Empire. Or I can be wrong, but even this or the Colus type. The Colus type was very, very common, much more than the Gallic, Italic, probably up to a certain point at least. So even the facies of the Roman legionnaire during the early empire was not very different from the one of the late republic, and sometimes from the middle republic, because we have to think that even with something we were already hinting at before with Marius, etc. There is this myth that Marius fundamentally created this new form of legionnaire on his own, based on the previous princeps. The idea, however, is that, and this is how you should interpret Marius at every time, which nobody does, but it's actually how we historically know this now for sure. Marius actually never changed anything. The only thing Marius actually did, the rest is all traditional, it's only attributed. The only thing that Marius actually did was the political thing, was abolishing the sensual classes and started recruiting the capite censi, right? That was it. The rest came by itself. You don't have to think that Marius actually changed every single detail of the Roman equipment. It didn't happen like that. Some of these changes that are historically attributed by the historians are even kind of ridiculous things, like on how the Romans had to bring the shield for not making it bang on the back of their legs when they were marching. But do you think the Romans kind of waited for centuries before Marius came and told them not to do so? Well, it's obviously fantasy. But the point I was making is that seemingly since the Second Punic War, as early as the Second Punic War, the idea that there was no actual difference anymore between the Astati, the Principes, and the Triarii was actually it's very probable. The same cohorts, at least vaguely, might have been employed as early as this Iberian campaign of Scipio. Also in here we will have to dedicate a massive amount of videos to explain how this fundamentally was. It's not that it takes a massive amount of, because the evidence is just like one. It's simply Polybius using the term semia that would be theoretically the equivalent, which was really not linguistically, because linguistically there are never equivalences, but to the Roman to the Latin cohorts. But let's say this should be violently inculcated into people's head, because too much has been attached to this Marian reform that actually was of massive importance. Don't get me wrong, Marius was a great general and a great reformer, an intelligent politician, a talented commander, everything you want. But what we're missing here, the focus is in how the Roman army actually evolved before, because armies, guess what, never evolve because there is a single autocrat reformer that decides to reform them and they change from one day to another. How it actually happens in military history is that armies change on their own, by themselves, by sheer usage, by sheer practice. By the way, there is not a single army that is equal to another, just like there is not a single soldier that is an equal to another. So it's always changing. Reforms are mostly, political and administrative changes that are brought to fundamentally, especially for strategical reasons, actually chiefly for political reasons, but then also strategically speaking. And then for what concerns the tactics, actually tactics kind of form themselves by themselves. Even though, of course, there can be certain accelerations, depending on the ability of a certain commander, genius of a certain commander, but fundamentally, armies always evolve by themselves, and they're always transformed by themselves. And the point I was making now is that the model of the Roman princeps that eventually was the one that Marius chose effectively to standardize, more or less, to uniform the tactical function of the legionnaires at this point, because social segmentation didn't exist anymore. This is the point. There was nothing to change. And the ancient social division between Astati, Principes, and Triarii was over, simply because all the Roman citizenry now, except the very few rich guys at the top, had become poor, who couldn't even afford his own weaponry. So how could you have, by the time of Marius, that was when the Roman society was in complete crisis, anything that resembled that on the field. It didn't exist anymore. It probably also didn't quite ever exist as we imagined. When is the moment that actually, these the triplex Agias actually had all the various ranks that were equipped just like that. It was always heterogeneous. But with this formula, let's say, of the soldier equipped with this lorica amata, the helmet, the scutum, the gladius, and the pila, you have a good thing, a good formula that remains unvaried at this point. We can clearly say from the time of the Punic Wars to essentially to the 3rd century, and that's really it. Because things didn't need to change. What do you need? How do you think soldiers work on the field? It's not the individual soldier that makes the problem how he's equipped, what he looks like. It's actually what you make him do on the field. What a state that takes him to war, drags him to war, is able to form him, like in terms of training, collective training, especially discipline, etc., and how he's led. And how he's equipped is something that comes by itself. You don't need to change that. And even though the Romans now start to progressively produce, even from their own weapons and armor, or at least the state starts, say better, obviously the Romans always did, but the state starts fundamentally extending its control on the process in order to keep the army in a kind of a consistent and homogeneous way. Also, chiefly for providing the troops with this equipment, not much because they wanted to standardize. The Romans didn't begin to create, to subcontract certain armory production just because they wanted the soldiers to look all alike. That was already happened. The problem was now actually supplying the troops with armor, because guess what? These were people who had nothing, as a matter of fact. So when they joined the army, they couldn't bring anything with them, and you had to give them that equipment. This, by the way, starts happening roughly. Even Marius himself didn't actually change that. Marius, in this sense, brought to the necessary and self-evident need to equip the soldiers, as we've just seen. But it's historically, it's just from the time of Cicero, or Cicero better, that we have some information about, which is not many years after, actually. It's just some decade, that we find certain statal manufacturers, fundamentally, that are actually private, that are simply established by convention to supply with their production that already existed before the troops of the state, the statal troops. And naturally, this all had its private preferential channels at the time. Just think about the first civil war with the triumvirate. You may think that individuals like Pompey or Crassus had their own, through their clientele, so also managed this thing on their own, because these troops had always been equipped in a certain way. By the way, the same consuls before, that's how they did. They received money from the aerarium, or aerarium, as we prefer, and which basically meant the Senate was saying, okay, I give you the money to equip, to raise a legion. That's how it literally happened, and therefore, even in Middle Republic, and even before, these consuls, say, bought, I don't know, thousands of helmets from one guy, or several smiths, etc., and then eventually distributed to the army. Because how do you think that, when the Romans started going campaigning into Greece or into Spain, that still before Marius, they literally brought all their equipment from home? It's obvious that they were given already before that. So this was also very progressive. It's not important to emphasize the change, the moment of change, the actual caesura, let's say, that brought to that, because there was none. And the same goes for the helmets themselves, for the equipment itself. I mean, in this case, the helmets. So this concept also of the ancient world lacked consistently the modern concept of mass production, right? They were not the means. These were pre-industrial times. States like the Roman one or others of great empires came close to kind of a serious production, let's say, because we know that the Roman army started to kind of uniform the equipment, to standardize it by a certain degree. But when we talk about standardization this time, we don't have to think anything resembling to the industrial production. Even the word helmets were, we know that the standard was just a generic panoply, right, to which the fighter had to attain himself. Because, by the way, even during when actual armories were managed by the state in order to provide the equipment to the army, still soldiers were largely equipped with other means in some ways. During the campaigns, definitely there were all types of means. I mean, if you think about the Gallic Wars in Caesar, I don't remember whether there is an actual evidence of this, but it's pretty obvious that many Roman legionnaires were equipped now with armor and weapons and armor that they had taken from the Celts, from the defeated Celts. The same goes for everyone. We actually are plenty of evidence. Sometimes there were Roman allies that, I mean, not the Roman allies like the Italics, but even kind of foreigners that supplied the Roman army. We have evidence of this, of Romans, I don't know, going to fight in Sicily or in Asia Minor, and the local powers that were allied with Rome kind of provided equipment for them. It was normal. So you can imagine that, if this was happening in this heavily Hellenized lands, this equipment would look more Greek than it would look like Italic. So you can understand what kind of heterogeneity had always existed since the beginning and how it kept existing, right? So the problem when we want to classify these helmets is that is exactly this: is that over the centuries, and also in the various operative scenarios where the Roman army fought, the equipment is extremely varied. It's extremely diverse. You can argue that every single piece is unique in himself. This is typical handmade stuff. I mean, this was craftsmanship at the time. There are typologies that are very similar that we can identify, but still every kind of helmet was done differently. And what I was saying is that even when the Romans had statal armories, let's say, great part of armors were actually also produced in the Roman camps. I mean, obviously, every Roman legion had ironsmiths, had people who were able to be self-sufficient, let's say, in a foreign land. It was obvious. It's like even today, even soldiers are, then go to military service, but also study other things, are capable of doing certain things that are both useful, in their military service, but also in the civilian life. And it was just like that at the time as well. And we are plenty of evidence is that the Roman castra were scattered along the frontiers, actually had all their own armory, where a consistent amount of armor was produced. And during the great expeditions that could happen, like think about the Dacian Wars and stuff like that, the practice was to take all these stocks and put them together and eventually to make them used to the legionaries. So you can imagine, we know archaeologically that every single every single province, for instance, had its own kind of styles. Maybe helmets were of similar shape because they were issued to be like that, but they had different decorations or different decorative styles, and ultimately every piece is singular, is unique, right? So classification is complicated. And the main problem at this point is not even actually identifying certain lines of evolution of helmets, but rather also finding common shared consensus, let's say, about how they have to be classified, because also this is our problem as moderns, that instead of trying to understand better how the whole thing works, we quarrel with each other to say, okay, which kind of systems do we use to classify? This need of classification is something that is born out of the Enlightenment. Before, we didn't reason like that. And this is also very important to understand the sources, because aside from the archaeological finds, sometimes you find in the sources certain names, right? And this happens not just, I'm not talking just about the Romans, this happens all the time also in medieval sources, etc. You have to think that, not even just in pre-modern times, but actually in pre-Enlightenment times, or even beyond, depending on, when you find a term used by the historian, by the author, etc., it doesn't mean the term is not a scientific, doesn't respond to a scientific category. So everything can be something very fluid semantically. This is particularly even, especially during the for what concerns the name of military units, etc. But even when you get to something so apparently banal like a helmet, well, that in there starts, for example, to be very generic. Like, you don't, most of the times when a helmet is named from sources, you don't actually know what kind of helmet it was. And it's kind of normal also because helmets were kind of the same. I mean, functionally speaking, how do you want an helmet to be? Just like, in fact, how do you want a shield to be? There are not many ways you can make an helmet. Or a shield. That's it. Another thing that is very important to remember is that the individual legionnaire could personalize his helmet all the time, because initially he received, initially, of course, as we know, tendentially the legionnaire had to provide his own equipment by tradition, but as we've seen, it's never been like that. But theoretically, along the way, the guy received a pay or loot, and therefore could take stuff and use in it. So it is typical, normal. But even when things were pretty advanced in terms of administration during the early empire, etc., still the same individual soldier could use his pay, for instance, to have an armor on his own. The military administration provided him some equipment, and for which he was initially due to pay, actually, because initially this thing of receiving an equipment theoretically always implied the idea that the legionnaire had to pay for his own equipment. Was the original idea, in fact, that everybody had to supply his own equipment since the beginning. That was still particularly detracted to the salary when the Romans became, from a salary when they became a professional militia. Then the whole thing kind of finished, also because it was overly complicated. But theoretically, at the end of the service, after many years, the soldier had to give back his equipment. Obviously, the Roman army couldn't afford definitely to lose equipment. Let's say at every 20 years that the military service finished. So obviously everything was returned to the military administration. But in the meanwhile, if the guy wanted to be equipped with something else, say, I want a better armor or better helmet, or this particular helmet, or reinforce, or wrist guard, or greave, or something like that, it could be perfectly possible that a guy went out there. I don't know, you were a Roman legionnaire stationed in Germany. You went to the local town where your castra were settled, and you told to the local smith, I want this, and the guy made it. And that's also why the differences arose. Always bearing in mind, naturally, and even though we don't know, I think, much, actually anything from it, there was definitely some equipment check, but for saying, I doubt that a Roman legionnaire would go to war like with a different weapon, for instance, than what was standardly issued. Like, by the way, the Roman legionnaire by himself had well, this is also probably true too sclerotic as an idea. Definitely for auxiliaries it's very easy to understand that it could have very different equipment, although most of it was the same legionary one. But the idea that the legionary usually didn't use things like spears, at least in early Roman times, aside from just some okay, they were used actually, but still so you see there was this theoretical standard, this uniform, this homogenization, but still things could vary in practice. So as long as you understand this, it's fine. Also because the Roman army the Roman legionaries, the Roman citizenry always fought alongside troops that were equipped with the most diverse weapons ever, that obviously didn't actually differ enormously from the standards that in the same Romans had in theory, but because it's not in the Iron Age where there are so many different weapons you can use. Romans definitely could use, the Roman legionaries where how to use bows, slings. They fought definitely also with their dolabrae or dolabre, that were kind of I don't know how you say it in English. What the hell, stupid internet? The pickaxe, something like that. But this fluidity is important to bear in mind. Simple as that. Those things could be used also as weapons, not just as tools for military engineering, and it was pretty easy. We know that the legionaries used them sometimes, especially against armored opponents. So you see here, everything was perfectly flexible. So when the archaeologist or the scholar comes to classify the finds according to a pre-established and shared criterion, lots of problems start, because everybody fundamentally has a say into it, which is normal, and it's meant to be like that. Also because everybody can find something new that has different characteristics, and it's important also to be picky in a certain sense, but still always never missing the essential what these finds actually were. There is a very vast bibliography on the topic. I'm personally no expert on all the various details, etc., but there is an enormous degree of detail you can go into that we're not gonna cover, not even when we're gonna make videos on the actual single types that of a helmet, in this case, or any other armament or equipment. So, however, scholars have to understand each other in some way. So the easiest thing is definitely to use different names, usually that correspond to the area of find, right? So that you hear all these names coming from the ancient settlements, etc., that correspond to a certain place. So when it comes to helmets that look similar, for instance, or that however are ascribable or attributable to a same typology of sort, you can try to avoid these mistakes and terminological confusion. That, however, still exists, because it's like with swords. I don't know. There is the oak shot. If I'm not wrong, classification here. I've been using the Robinson's one because it's the only one that, as we will see, also has this evolutionary aim to try to spot this kind of transformation. Is also important because this reveals you, by the way, there are certain classifications that do not take into consideration the change over time. Just like look at the find and say, okay, they look alike. Obviously, they try to date the find, but they don't give a damn about maybe these are people who maybe do not know excessively much about the rest of military history. It happens in many fields. So it's important to cross-sect all the various evidence that we have in order to give a meaning to the singular finds. So as I was saying before, I use Robinson's classification. I believe it's I mean, I don't have any particular sympathy in itself. I mean, to me, it's just something I follow because I believe it's the most famous. It's the most useful. Sometimes it's in part it's more rational. From your side, it's also the clearer one. This was well, it's more than 40 years old. It was from 1975. But I think that up to today, it's still the only type of classification that attempts at least to delineate a sort of evolutionary logic in the production and spread of the helmets. So naturally Robinson's Robinson classification has been effective because also other scholars have basically accept when other finds were discovered, for instance after 1975, to make the various finds fitting into get the categories that Robinson had drawn. So sometimes it was not possible because sometimes there were helmets that sensibly differed and that also formed kind of similar, branches, sub-branches, or even kind of typization on their own. But more or less, Robinson's ones kind of works. So in this phase of the Rage Republic, the helmets analyzed by Robinson are by the overwhelming majority this three types that we mentioned before, because there is a large archaeological evidence at this point that makes us say, okay, these were actually what the Roman legionaries on average wore at the time. That is the Montefortino, the Colus, and the Agen-Port. So these are kind of iconic, at least if you are familiar with Roman helmets, kind of iconic types. And the Montefortino one, they're actually seemingly all kind of Celtic in origin, but there is a particular difference, especially in the Roman army, between the spread of the Montefortino and the Colus and the Agen-Port, because the last two types are evidently the result of the Celtic influence in terms of technology of making and of iron, let's say, of metal making, that the Romans had during the expansion towards Central Europe, right? So this started happening chiefly with the, let's say, after the consolidation of the Roman domination of northern Italy. So the Po Valley was Gaul, effectively Cisalpine Gaul, and inhabited by peoples that had the same Montefortino, if I'm not wrong, comes from there. Look at what the hell here, the stupid internet. And and I don't remember where I was going with the phase, but and after the expansion towards into Gaul, naturally. So this is these are the two stages that are more important. The Montefortino helmets are witnessed since pretty early time, right, into the Roman army. So roughly from 300 BC onwards, and well into the 1st century AD, right? And this was also the cheaper one to produce, one of the most effective, and that's also a reason why it was so widespread in the Celtic world as well. So the Montefortino, it's not that it has a great deal of similarity, for instance, with the Intercisa or Interchisa one of the later centuries, from that in fact appear from the 3rd to the 4th century, but because in terms of how they're in structure, that they're very, very different. But they both represent, in this sense, the 1.0 helmet that the average trooper would, that was cheap to produce and pretty widespread and effective. Also, the Montefortino had a kind of evolution in the same Roman army, because this is interesting when you find several finds that come from say from the Celtic world proper. Then you analyze the ones that are instead we know were Roman. You realize that in these two environments things evolved slightly in a different way. Then there are the Colossus and the Agen-Port that are different. They're more enveloping, they are more protective, they have cheek guards more consistently pronounced. They tend also in here, these helmets were built in various ways. We will analyze them on another occasion, but they tended to evolve, that they were kind of more protective and more solid than the Montefortino, let's say, and this partly was necessary because of the seemingly fact of the different military environment, let's say, the different warfare that the Romans had to cope with in Gaul, in that case, into Central Europe, where in fact these helmets are already being found. Naturally, as we always say, we tend to find this kind of mechanicistic explanations for which the Romans started using these helmets just because they wanted to protect themselves from heavier blows like the ones of the Celtic spada or something like that. Yeah, but it's not only like that. There is still the idea that Rome kind of expanded at this time, probably also started to invest more in its military expenses, etc., in equipping soldiers with kind of troops, and a reinforced helmet is good wherever you fight. You know, it's obvious that if you look like the Gallic imperial type, that is consistently, you know, what the most similar things to Celtic helmets that of a certain type, by the way, that were used by the Roman army. Well, yeah, but if in this sense you compare it with it's obvious that the Romans started to adopt them chiefly with those functionalities because they were dealing with enemies that had a warfare that had produced those for its needs those same shapes, those same forms. But still, you know, an element like that could be very useful also elsewhere. Always given that details are important, because everything, for instance, that adds to as an element to the helmet adds, for instance, to its weight, to its cost. But at the same time, the ways and factors that intervened are not fully known to us. We don't know how effectively how spread the various typologies were quantitatively. How they were actually used in action, meaning how many troops and which troops used these helmets, for instance. Definitely we know something about it, but it's mostly iconographical evidence, and that is not really like everything that we can happen. So some functions are evident from the same shapes, from the same characteristics, but the extent to which this made a difference is not necessarily known. We can only say that, of course, this helmet, let's say, protects better than this one, but at the same time, you know, wars are not won by that, because maybe a war is won if you have more troops on the field rather than better protected. We don't know. That depends on the circumstance. It might have not even been a rational reason at one point, or at least it probably was, but it wasn't rationalized, maybe derived from other factors that brought to that as a consequence, and not because of the thorough decision of which kind of helmets had to be chosen, given also all that freedom and customization that we have talked about before. Yet there are those lines that you can still follow and say, okay, orientatively, things were like that. Okay. And iconography is also very important. Aside from the actual archaeological helmets, physical elements, there are many helmets as objects, there are definitely lots of images that we can observe, and it emerges from this survey, in fact, a greater tendency towards the Hellenistic derivation, so that still in iconography the Romans wanted at this time to represent their helmets more like kind of a Greek fashion. So there is say evidence of several types of helmets that were kind of Hellenistic looking, that however at the same time of which however we don't have great archaeological evidence. So this is always also a memento, let's say, in order to never to think that what you see in iconography is what existed in reality. Because, for instance, most of what we iconographically think about, what we think about the Roman army in early imperial time, is literally what we get from Trajan's column. And when we look at that iconography and we confrontate it with the archaeological reality all around the frontiers, for instance, we see that there is something very different. And this is particularly interesting because Trajan's column was effectively a propaganda work that had to show certain things for the people of Rome, that had to, etc. But reality is wholly different. In this sense, archaeology is often more, more, you can say more reliable in itself. Obviously, it kind of gives you, a hard fact that, but it also has its fault. But at the same time, it teaches you to say, okay, not all we see is what it was like. Okay. So for what it concerns, also iconography is important. For instance, there are lots of iconography on the money of the time that is pretty much underestimated, and is instead a very valuable source. That is also a bit classicistic, traditionalistic. This kind of taste for archaic shapes and forms, etc. But it's still valuable because it tells you what that society looked at equipment like at the time, and you can't interpret it by itself. You just need also to know what history of art, of literature, of contacts with with other peoples, etc. Because everything is way more complicated than it seems. So the moral of the story is we don't know really what the Romans looked like for real. By the way, another thing that is often overlooked is that equipment was extremely colorful, and the helmets had attached crests, for instance. Not just officers had. Actually, it was normal for every tribal warrior at the time having this kind of things. The italics did the same exact thing. So even if we look at Caesar times, you know that the Roman legionnaire on average had this beautiful long crest, and that is particularly important. Crests even today into actual combat are important. At the time, especially in combat, was important. Today, obviously, they're kind of not anymore because weapons kind of got more lethal. So it's kind of not a good idea to go out there with crests. But this was true until the striped. Excuse me. Let me see how you call this. This is true how the striped gun barrel fundamentally came into place, because before that was normal. So you don't have to underestimate the value, the tactical importance of crests in terms of morale, especially. Every soldier has always wanted to look taller and more fierce, to fearsome and I don't know. Do you say fearsome? Yeah, whatever. I have to stop the video because I'm starting to invent words. But in this sense, yeah, there are so many factors that make up the ultimate result, and fixating ourselves just on the classification is something that naturally we must do by some certain standards because it's what we find. But always bear in mind that that is not all, and that probably there were even certain types of helmets about which we know nothing about, maybe were not so widespread, were less widespread at least than the other typologies, but that probably were used at the time, and that always could appear and reappear over time. So that yeah, and by the way, now okay, there are other considerations, for instance, on how these classical designs, especially the one from ancient Greece, remained even in the I don't know, thinking about Byzantine iconography, because everything was based, iconography was largely influenced now by Greek art. The Romans hadn't had a kind of an art on their own. They started imitating the Greeks, this kind of Apollinic forms, these perfections, etc. And the Greeks had this love for harmonic shapes, etc. So even representing certain types of helmets compared to others was a way to say, okay, that's just because it looks good and there is a complex philosophical and artistical taste behind it, but it's not what was actually used on the battlefield. But obviously I don't have to tell you this, you can understand it clearly on your own. So this was just a little bit an introduction in this sense, and it is valid not just for late Republican helmets, but in general for every kind of period at this time, and it's valid not just for the Romans but for every other people even. The main difference that Rome has is that what other peoples didn't have objectively is that Rome now had a degree of standardization of its equipment that nobody else had ever had. It wasn't actually that different from the others, but definitely Rome now could invest in a massive military administration that had to make things work in a certain way. So the needs of uniformity and standardization were kind of dictated by pragmatism and not by actual direction from the top, like because of some functionalistic reason how these helmets had to be shaped. So what is important is that probably the Romans at this time had kind of the most we're still putting, actually let's put it better, because it is true that the Romans at this point started using certain helmets of a certain shape. So even abandoning completely the idea that there was no direction from the top in terms for the shape of helmets is not necessarily right. The point that has to be understood is that now the Romans had put together the experience of hundreds of years of warfare. So the helmets that had come to exist were already by themselves the right ones. So that's what the Romans choose. But in this sense, they were already in use. So there was, in this sense, no real decision from the top. But at the same time, yeah, this standardization was due exactly to that. Like, to find the kind of helmet that could be produced in the cheapest way, that could be provided in largest numbers, or that could be more readily available, that was, let's say, effective against the kind of enemies that Rome had to fight. And this was left largely, I believe, to the same legionnaires that eventually, had not the decisional process, but they had a practice that had shaped more or less the face of the Roman legionnaire at that time, in its terms of his appearance, of his outfit. So that was outfit sounds bad. Let's say it's gear, their gear, but at this point there was probably a middle ground that we can't focus on, because it was probably between the senatorial class that was made up the generals, etc., and the NCOs that said, okay, we have to supply these guys with with certain armor, which kind we use. So they were the ones who consistently now managed the money that were given by the military administration. We had to invest into this. So that's where the thing probably happened, in my opinion. And yeah, we will observe in other videos the single types and define their characteristics. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.